Good afternoon, and thank you for joining this week's edition of RPI's Tech Talk series. My name is Dan Farruggio, and I'm honored to be your host today. This week, we're shaking things up a bit and bringing in the experts. We're having a live panel discussion on topics that are exciting and relevant to you and really any organization out there that has an interest in contract management. During this discussion, you can expect to hear anything from real-life, on-the-job experiences to leading practice recommendations. Before we meet our panelists this afternoon, I'd like to remind you that today's discussion is scheduled to last about 15 to 20 minutes, and it does allow for time for a Q&A session at the end. At any time, please feel free to ask questions via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If your questions are not answered during our live discussion, we will follow up with a communication after our discussion. And with that, it is with great pleasure to introduce to you today's panel experts, Ms. Stephanie Marquez and Ms. Sasha Delfeus.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. Hi, everybody. Very happy to be with you today. As Dan mentioned, my name is Stephanie Marquez. I am a supply chain consultant here with RPI. I've been with RPI for, about a year and a half now, working on version 11 implementations. Specifically, contract management is kind of my niche area. Being a former contract manager user in a healthcare organization here in Rochester, New York, where I'm joining you from today. You got a lot of different takeaways. I'm excited to have this conversation. So thanks for being with us.
Hi, I'm Sasha Delfeus. I'm calling in from the Baltimore office. I started at RPI October 2019 as a supply management business analyst, and I've had the opportunity to support multiple full cycle implementation projects, all of which utilize the contract management module to some degree. So I'm excited to share what I've learned thus far with the topics we plan to discuss. Thank you.
All right. Thank you both for joining us. We appreciate everyone taking the time out of your busy schedules and joining us today for our discussion. And so recently, we've been hearing and feeling a lot of excitement in the industry around contract management, specifically in CloudSuite. We all know it could be somewhat of a daunting undertaking or seem like a tall order at first. But we know that if you're with us and you're joining us today, you're like us in that you're continuously looking for ways to get better and learn and share your experiences with the community. So not only do we get better as an organization, but as a community. So whether you're looking to expand your usage of contract management or deciding to implement a net new contract management project, or you've been working with contract management for a number of years. If there's one thing that we could all really agree on is that proper planning and thorough design are critical elements to the success and long-term viability of your solution. So Stephanie, if someone approached you at a user group saying, hey, we own contract management, but have been using it somewhat lightly for a year or two, but we'd love to really get more out of it and utilize more of its potential. We just don't know where to start. What kind of advice or recommendations might you suggest to someone that has those type of questions?
Yeah, I really love that question and this type of conversation. And I've found through conversations with clients that I'm currently engaged with and from my own experience as a user that there's typically quite a lot of functionality that's underutilized. I've seen, one of the main pain points that I continuously hear even now is that folks are still on a paper contract process system. So printing out their contracts, passing them around the department, maybe using outdated templates or contract templates, that are each department kind of has their own rendition of it, emailing things back and forth. So rather than letting the system kind of work for them and increase their efficiencies, those are the types of optimizations, if you can make the system, lean into how it's intended to be used, that can make a world of difference to the end users.
Great. So there's a lot of good points you mentioned there. And one of the major pain points you brought up is organizations that are still primarily operating under a paper or manually based process. What kind of functionality does contract management offer and have available to assist with transitioning from a manual paper-based system to a more efficient electronic style system?
Yeah, definitely. I mentioned, being an end user and coming to RPI and working on different engagements and really kind of digging into the application and all that it has to offer. Definitely there's just a greater, operation in using the terms and conditions or contract approvals or contract redlining. There are certain things like when I was a functional user and really learned how to implement here at RPI, I thought to myself, man, why didn't we do that in my past life? Why didn't we leverage that? It would have saved so much time, like document templates, milestones, deliverables, things like that really help you stay on top of the communication around your contract within the organization and within the department. Plus, it just kind of helps you really leverage the updates and the system functionality that the Infor Lawson system has to offer.
Sounds great. And I heard a lot of juicy topics in there, and I'd love to kind of dig in on a few of those. So you mentioned building out a terms and conditions library. Would you mind talking a little bit more on what exactly that is and why the terms and conditions library is very important?
I'm actually going to lean into Sasha for this one.
Yeah, so I like terms and conditions a lot, setting it up in that whole process. I think is really helpful because it's a library that you can load your organization's terms and conditions. Many times we see organizations using a large number of Word documents or PDF templates for their contracts, and the terms and condition repository is a great opportunity for an organization to just standardize their contract language and use the other features that's already in the contract management module, like contract documents and contract approvals, and let the system build your contract for you. And we find that it's helpful for a number of things. So, of course, standardization, like Steph and I discussed, reducing the number of templates to maintain, and the fact that it's working with other features in contract management, you're capable of making updates to the agreements in the system from the terms and conditions that you've already built in your repository. There's also a terms manager role, a contract terms manager role, and this kind of locks down who in the organization is going to manage those terms and conditions, and that's probably going to be someone from legal, so that kind of probably makes them sleep a little bit better at night. And there's also a way to categorize your terms for specific departments, so that's really helpful. And with the contract terms manager role, or anyone honestly creating the terms and conditions in the repository, there's a feature for you to allow or not allow modifications once it's added to the contract. So it kind of creates that restriction if that's what you're looking for.
That makes a lot of sense, and it sounds like it's something that could add a tremendous amount of efficiency and really streamlining process within your contract management and processing. And as you're talking, I got a lot of questions bubbling up here, so I'm going to try not to jump around too much here. But I do have a two-part question that I'd kind of like to see what your thoughts are on that. So is the terms and conditions library something that can evolve over time as the organization evolves, or if it's something that we've as an organization, we've already implemented contract management and we've been live for some time, but we haven't rolled out a terms and conditions library. Is that something that we could do, today or as part of planning? And whether it's, again, like we're net new or we've been live for a while, like what kind of things have you experienced that are helpful to know or think about going into a planning or preparation phase?
Yeah, so you definitely can implement it, after you already have contract management set up. One thing I've noticed with clients that I've supported, they implement contract management in 2 phases. So the first phase is just kind of getting contract management acquainted with it, really, with it being a new module and something completely different from users who have experience with Lawson. So then they get comfortable with that. But then the phase 2 is when they start talking about the other features, such as terms and conditions. And that is really helpful. And I think something that you want to consider up front is just making sure that you're actually having these thoughtful conversations beforehand. I mean, those design discussions will lead up to it anyways, but just kind of keeping in mind that things are going to change, being willing to change, and just kind of seeing it through as well, trusting the process. I would definitely say that is really helpful.
Sure. And what types of folks would you expect or have found to be useful or very informative in having those planning discussions when you start talking about these phase 2 type initiatives?
I think your key players are going to definitely be helpful when you're considering this plan. Definitely having some select internal resources, a team of them from different departments to kind of get some input on how this impacts them down the line. And with that, you want to make sure that those resources are representing the various departments within your organization. So the representative from legal or the team of representatives from legal versus a team of representatives from purchasing. You want to make sure that those contract templates that you're designing and the terms and conditions that you're loading make sense and is represented well for all the departments across the board.
Sure. Awesome. So once we have those conversations and we have our planning phase is pretty much complete and we start working on a design, and once everyone is in agreement on a design, what level of effort does it take to implement the terms and conditions library? And are there any tools available out there to help leverage implementing or loading all those terms and conditions?
Yes and yes. So I would say that the effort overall is definitely minimum. I mean, from creating it from a testing perspective, you can manually create articles and terms and build out your terms and conditions, and you can just kind of understand how that process works on a manual basis. But you can also utilize Infor Spreadsheet Designer, or ISD, which is a helpful tool to help upload all that data quickly. I'll definitely say with that level of effort, even though it's minimum, you still want to have a level of attention to detail that's definitely required. You want to make sure that you're capturing all the correct verbiage in there, because if this is kind of trickling down to your contracts and those contract documents, you just want to make sure everything is literally spelled out to a T.
Brought up a lot of great points there. Thank you. Sure. So if having done this several times in the past, if you could go back to the first time you implemented or helped implement a terms and conditions library, knowing what you know now, what are some things that if it's a customer's first time implementing would be helpful for them to know and plan for?
Okay, so 3 words for you. Text variable replacement. I'm telling you right now, once I learned it, my mind was literally blown away. And it's just like, once you have your terms and conditions uploaded, you're of course letting the system work for you, and then you're manually changing the text so that instead of it says in brackets supplier, the text variable replacement can just capture the supplier mapping, so that every time you're creating a contract document or a contract, it's just mapping the supplier that you already have selected for your contract. I'm telling you, I don't know, I could just go on and on about how much I love that, but it's just such a key feature that if you don't know about, please educate yourself on it. It's very, very helpful. The other thing I will say I wish I knew was when utilizing Infor Spreadsheet Designer, making sure that your article number that the system automatically assigns matches with the terms and conditions that are being added. If they're created separately, you just want to make sure that again, that level of attention to detail is captured, because otherwise it could get a little tricky, and it's like you have to do more cleanup than you wish you had to begin with. I find that just get it right, pay attention the first time, and you're gonna be a lot happier at the end.
That's some good advice. Thank you for sharing. All right, so one of the themes that we've seen recurring is that approvals in the negotiation phase of any kind of contract is often the culprit for slowing down your process pretty significantly. What kind of options or tools does contract management offer that can assist with adding some efficiencies and cutting down on processing time?
Yeah, that's definitely a key point that we see in a lot of organizations. And so I'll say with this, contract management and the approvals that the system allows with contract redlining or contract document redlining really work to their maximum capacity or efficiency when coupled with supplier portal and strategic sourcing. They can be used without, so it's not, if your organization isn't using those two modules, it's not the end of the world. But it's helpful to know that you can maximize, again, what the system offers. So keeping in mind that Infor offers 4 standard classification approval types, right? So there's multiple classifications and sub-classifications that can be set up, and those are really used to help define what route your contract is going to take as it's flowing through the system. So we know that classifications are required when you create a contract. There are different types of classification examples that we've seen used in the past to help the end user or the contract manager make the appropriate selection. So sometimes we might see a corporate no approvals classification type, or facility approvals no redlining classification type, just to provide you with a couple of examples. And those classifications also in turn can impact the way in which addendums or amendments are created and maintained within the system. So going back to your original contract grouping setup, there's really a lot of different flexibility within creating that setup that impacts that downstream approval process. So yeah, there's just, folks really kind of don't know where to start when you think about it and think about, well, I have this and I need it to go here, or I need it to go to this department. It can be really overwhelming for users.
Sure. I'm sure there's a lot of planning that goes into an approval process or an approval hierarchy. Do you normally see approvals being done early on in a design, or is that something that kind of is talked about and then tweaked and fine-tuned as a project goes on?
Yeah, as Sasha mentioned earlier, we see a lot of contract management implementations happening in this 2-phased approach. For a lot of organizations, and all of them that I've encountered working here at RPI, they really haven't used contract management before. And so our primary goal is to get the client standing up on the system, increase the level of familiarity with the system so they feel more at ease navigating through. So in these implementation projects, most likely their business processes are changing. So we find that if we kind of front load a project with all these intricacies, such as these contract approvals, it can really hinder their confidence in using the application and the long-term success. So when thinking about planning it, my recommendation will always be to keep it simple. Keep it simple to start. Become familiar with your system. You really kind of, after a go live, determine what works and what doesn't. Maybe you go back after the fact and make some changes, but later on down the road, if you take into consideration during design how you may want the system to work for you in the future, we definitely can support that type of setup, because you also don't want to, you know, kind of push yourself into a corner or keep yourself into a box and limit what you can do and what's possible later on down the road. I think one of the things that is imperative to planning this type of functionality is it's critical to understand your existing approval process, right? So it's not enough just to talk through that process. It really becomes helpful to the users when you have that process documented. I am a strong proponent for Visio process flows. I think I'm a visual person, most people are. So when you can actually see at what juncture maybe a contract needs to go to legal for review or needs to go to you know, procurement management for review, it really helps in determining that level of detail. I think also, collaborative testing is key. So if you're considering incorporating your approval process across multiple different departments, getting those folks in a room together and testing that out to see, okay, are there any process gaps? You know, can we identify any system limitations where, you know, maybe this type of functionality doesn't work for this specific type of contract. And one other thing I'll conclude on this as far as your planning is considered, documenting your contract types, subtypes, and classification selection, and what I like to call a matrix, again, helps with really kind of understanding what flow options are available. So the visual Visios are great, but putting some level of detail into, you know, a spreadsheet that really breaks down all of the possibilities is helpful. It's a great tool for additional users to go back and reference if they have questions on, you know, okay, well, I have this contract type and this subtype, which approval path is most appropriate? When you have it documented, again, it just builds that level of confidence for the user as they're going forward with either their implementation or their enhancement.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all that detail. There's a lot of good points in there. So in thinking of like organizations that are looking to either deploy or improve upon their current approval process, it sounds you mentioned the matrix of your contract types and classifications. Are there any other prerequisites that you would certainly recommend be clearly defined or already in place before looking at your approval process design? Is there any kind of prerequisites that you would recommend occur before going into design of an approval process?
I guess I would say, as far as a operational standpoint prerequisite, knowing what the current state looks like really helps to determine what that future state looks like. You know, there are some system prerequisites from a functionality standpoint. Again, taking into consideration how your classification and approval types are designed, you want to lean into the flexibility that the system offers without kind of backing yourself into a corner or a box. I would also strongly recommend, you know, leaning onto a technical resource, whether it's within your own organization, because from a, you know, again, a system functionality standpoint, there are some, you know, process service definitions that you really want to make sure are turned on. That way, when you get through kind of this testing process, or excuse me, the design process, and you go to test, things are flowing through the system the way that they should be. I found in experiences, it's kind of this thing that gets a little bit overlooked because a lot of the functional front-end users, they're not, you know, the technical folks. So they don't realize that there's different aspects from a service definition or processing that has to be turned on in the system to make their flows work. So we see, like, you know, we put in all this design time and we're testing it and nothing's happening. And mostly it's those very simple fixes that you just make sure are enabled in your system.
Sure. Yeah, that's great advice to bring in a technical resource into the mix, sooner rather than later to help with that design. I mean, does the approval, do they leverage IPA? Is it pretty straightforward out of the box, or have you seen like a lot of configurations or customizations that are needed?
So the system does offer, the processing, the IPAs out of the box, which is a very straightforward process flow. In a lot of organizations that I've worked with, they build on that, right? So it's great to get them started, but it's not a one size fits all. So there are certain levels of customizations that we do see to that IPA that really help to enhance the user experience. I've worked with a client before that had, several different classification or approval types established, and it seemed like a lot up front, but when you kind of broke it down from a technical side, it made a lot of sense. It was something that they were able to kind of categorize to help keep their approval process clean. So there wasn't, a weird sort of overlap. They determined, okay, our facilities agreements always need to go here.
Oh, we might have lost Stephanie for a moment.
Yeah, so do you mind for me repeating the question? I could probably follow along if that's okay with you. Add my points to it.
Sure. Yeah, we were just talking about some the functionality that's back. Available potentially out of the. You're back.
It's real life, right? Technical issues, and I saw everyone smiling faces, and then I was like, I think I might be frozen. So.
Welcome back.
Yes. So yeah, it sounds like we're kind of you're wrapping up on the question of some out-of-the-box features that can be configured and customized on an organizational base. So it's pretty flexible in the sense that within reason, it's possible to pretty much get the approvals to do anything you really need them to do.
Yep, exactly.
Awesome. And so we talked a lot about approvals, and we also mentioned some redlining. Can you talk a little bit about the redlining process and how that works within contract management, and from a systematic standpoint, what a user might expect to see while utilizing that functionality?
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's helpful to understand that there are two redlining options, right? So you have redlining on contract, or you have redlining on document. Redlining on contract is a really awesome feature, and this is kind of where all of these topics sort of overlap, right? So we talked about, or Sasha talked about, the terms and conditions repository. When a user is leaning into building out their contract, leveraging that repository, that redlining on contract process allows the approver to look at each one of those articles, terms and conditions that are associated with that contract, and they can go into the system and make changes. And so what the system does is the system actually redlines their changes, so the next approver in line can see what update has been made. And then, at the end of the approval process, assuming all of those changes are made, the final approver approves everything, and the system will update all of the language that's been updated. So that's kind of one aspect of redlining. There's this other aspect of redlining on document, which essentially is exactly what it sounds like. You're leaning into the functionality of using a redline document like a Word doc to pass through your approval process. This is used in version 11 in conjunction with document management. So when the red line on document feature is used, the approver receives their notification. They can actually open the document and it'll take them or redirect them to document management where they can check in and out that document. The great thing about that is from a contract management standpoint, or the contract admin who's in charge of getting that agreement through the process, they can see when that document has been checked out and when it's been reviewed and who's checked it back in. And just using, your Word track changes, you go in there, you make your updates, check it back into document management, and it refreshes and makes those updates as well. So again, there's a lot of different functionality that in a lot of organizations has yet to be explored. And I'll say this again, that type of process also works really well if you're leveraging the supplier portal module as well, because you can redline and negotiate that contract through the system back and forth with your supplier. So once everyone who is in that process needs to review that document and has made their red lines, you can go back in, accept all changes, and you have a fresh, clean document. And again, the document management system in version 11 tracks all of those different versions. So it'll timestamp that history and it'll let you know, who's done what when.
That's really helpful to know. You answered my question before I could even ask it of, are you able to see all the redlining versions before you have the final product? And I think that's very, very helpful functionality. And so you mentioned the document that is created from within the system, and it uses Infor Document Management, or IDM. Is that something that is you could create and customize as your templates when creating your contracts? I know you mentioned it earlier on when talking about the terms and conditions library, is that you could add them to your own contract, and you also brought up document templates. Before we get into actually talking about document templates, I want to pick your brain a little bit on that. But can you just touch just a little bit on the effort? I know we talked about the approvals, but what kind of effort or involvement is required to get redlining working in this system?
Yeah, I would say redlining and really all of your contract approvals really is a significant level of effort. It requires, again, those heavy design sessions, understanding the operational process flows throughout the organization. It requires a certain level of coordination between your, end user and technical development folks. You definitely want to make sure that you're documenting for future state process. So you don't necessarily have to implement the redlining aspect at the same time as, maybe just an approval, no redlining, but you want to make sure that it's built within the system and that functionality is there. And I can't stress it enough, testing. That's the best thing you can do for yourself when you have gone through such a process to really determine that level of detail, for a contract, for the organization, for the department, testing it collaboratively with that approver, whether it be a session in the same type of, room together, so you can actually see and make sure that that contract is flowing the way that you anticipate it. So it's not overly complex, and I think it's just the level of detail and the collaborative efforts that make that level of effort, more significant than, maybe implementing the terms and conditions library.
Sure. Yeah. So it sounds like the margin for error is a lot slimmer when setting this up. It's more, if it's right, it should be working. But if there's any number of areas that, if anything is off by a little bit, it could give you undesirable results or just not work in general.
Exactly.
So yeah, I know early on we talked about some contract documents and some templates, and that sounds pretty interesting. So Sasha, would you mind talking a little bit on contract documents and contract templates and what they are, how they're helpful, and how they could benefit organizations that are leveraging contract management?
Sure. So what it is, Infor provides two types of document templates for contract management. So it's going to be a document template and an addendum template. The contract document template specifically is used to define information for a contract. An addendum template works in that same way, but it's specific to information when the contract's in an addended status. So let's say I'm changing the terms and conditions. You'll see on the addendum document the changes on the terms and conditions. And Stephanie, correct me if I misspoke there, please, and thank you. I find it to be helpful because, of course, you're standardizing your contract document templates. So when you're having a variety of document templates that you've just already had before, implementing this project, you just kind of want to have, this is an opportunity to make them consistent, and that's really helpful. There's templates that's already provided in the Infor system. So when you're thinking about what you want to how you want to design your template, you can think about, well, maybe I'll just keep it standard out of the box because what they have is perfect, or maybe you want to add a few fields, or maybe you want to change it up completely. That choice is yours, but definitely standardizing will definitely be helpful. And something to keep in mind is documents outline the business relationship and scope of work between you and the supplier. That contract document that you're creating in contract management helps create that outline when you're developing your contract in the system. It's definitely best when used with terms and conditions. As we already discussed, they're definitely intertwined. So as I'm building out my contract and I'm adding those T's and C's, when I'm ready to create my contract document, all of those terms and conditions will be mapped on it as well. And it's helpful if, depending on the type of template you're looking for. So maybe you're looking for the templates that can be assigned to like a contract classification, which we would be using based off like approval routings and whatnot. You might want to consider an IDM template or Infor document management. And that just kind of maximizes the functionality within the system. Or you might want to just keep a simple one, which would be a rich text format template, and you can use Microsoft Word to make updates and changes to it. And then as long as those fields are mappable, use that in your contract and bring those fields over when you're printing out your contract. And with the RTF one, the difference there is that the contract classifications, you can attach a template, whether it be for contract documents and for addendum documents. IDM templates, it's just contract documents at this time. So those are things that you definitely want to consider, but of course, those options are there for you to explore. And then the final thing I'll mention here is that the document template for contracts, there's a repository there, so it just makes it easier, of course, for you to organize and manage your templates moving forward. Maybe you want to change one over time, maybe you want to get rid of one and activate one. Those options are there for you.
Those sound very helpful in just the general processing of contracts. Especially the creation of them. I know you mentioned that there's two types of document templates for the actual contract and for addendum. Are you able to have multiple documents for each type? So you can have multiple contract document templates and multiple addendum templates?
Yes. So just like we've talked about with terms and conditions, that repository that you can house a number of terms and conditions, you can do the same thing with contract documents and addendum documents. And they're actually stored in two different sections, but you can make changes to both of them and activate both of them, remove them as you will.
Great. So if I were a potential customer or client, and I had a question. I saw you walking around the user group again, and then I said, hey, Sasha or Stephanie, we're interested in document templates. And we have everything right now on paper, and they're all stashed in a filing cabinet somewhere, but we're interested in these document templates. What would you recommend us doing to prepare and start planning to deploy and create our document templates. What would you recommend as a good starting point?
So I think the first thing I would probably ask them is what information you're putting on your documents today. I think that's going to be helpful because we can kind of identify pretty quickly what type of information we can just map over in the contract document template. So how much information is important? And then another thing I would think about is what type of template do you want to use? And at that point, that's something you probably want to consider during design sessions and testing sessions, identifying that the limitations between the two types of document types, which again would be the RTF versus the IDM. IDM, that's going to be helpful because there's a fact sheet that's housed within FSM, and it provides you with a list of fields for field mapping. Now, that's like if you wanted to add additional fields that's not in that field mapping list, that's something that you would probably require technical support for setup and development, but those options are there. So it really just stems down to what are they looking for and how much information do you think you need moving forward. And another thing I would think about is you're not just creating like the end all be all for just one template. You could create multiple templates. So document template A can have articles and terms, but document template B, you know that it's kind of like a low dollar amount contract. You don't really need that much information on there, and it could be set up completely different. So it just really all depends on what you're looking for. I know another thing that I want to point out again is a system limitation. At this time, IDM doesn't support an addendum document template out the box, so you're unable to like assign it to a contract classification. So you're really interested in IDM and interested in using everything IDM as far as documents are concerned, and you want to utilize that for contracts. That is something that you want to be aware of when you're setting that up and attaching IDM document templates to your classifications for approvals.
Sure, that's definitely good to know going into to planning. And what would you say from planning to deploying your templates? What level of effort would you say is or guess is involved there?
I would say there's a moderate level of effort. It really just all depends on the design of the documents and the assistance needed from tech. So I've seen clients utilize IDM documents, and not necessarily for contract management, but it would require a custom field, a custom user field added to that document. That requires an additional lift. But maybe you're just looking for add supplier, remove supplier, some of the basic fields that are provided in the fact sheet, for example, or something that isn't necessarily custom. The level of effort is pretty much low, and that's probably something that a functional user can manage on their own, but it's possible that you might need a technical user as well. And again, kind of going back to the discussion of the layout of the document template, what you're looking for, all those things are kind of nested into that level of effort. Another thing to keep in mind would definitely be testing. Cannot stress that enough. For example, you add a field in there, you put it in there, it's saved, you attach the template, and then when you test it out, it's not there. Those things matter, and that you might find that like tedious work, but it's definitely critical if you're trying to get that information, correct down the line. And then you also want to think about the number of templates that you need for the organization. Maybe a certain department needs a certain number of templates, and maybe within those departments, the number of templates vary based on the contract types that they're setting up, and the level of detail that's needed for each document template. So it just really all depends on organization by organization. And also there's some documentation that you would want to consider, just having all that set up for the future state design.
That's some really great advice. And it sounds like there's some varying levels of effort depending on how much you want to use them and the style in which you want to create your document template. So it's good to know there's different options out there within to really leverage document templates. So a lot of the things we've been talking about so far have related to processes and getting things up and running. But one of the really important parts of contracts and contract management itself is tracking the contract, tracking specific parts and pieces of a contract to make sure you're staying on track. You're not running any kind of over budget. What kind of things are out there within contract management that could be set up to track these kinds of things?
Yeah, I love utilized functionality that I see across organizations, and that's the milestones and deliverables that are associated with contracts. So it's a great way to track that specific type of information that you're talking to, whether it's a capital agreement that requires the contract manager to track, the actual construction build, the electrical, the different stages typically have a dependency on one another, and it just gives the organization, the contract team, that specific level of visibility that is oftentimes missing. Deliverables, they operate very similarly within the system, but those typically apply to your, professional services type of engagements where, a specific deliverable is required from the supplier throughout the contract process. So, for example, education or training documentation, something like that. And so there is absolutely no type of custom setup that's required. It's great functionality that's already there. And they both, like I said, they operate similarly. There are a few differences, but they both allow you to assign a person that's responsible for that milestone or deliverable. You can track the percent to completion for your milestone, or you can just indicate a specific date that something is due if it's a deliverable, and you can close it out once that deliverable is complete. Similarly to a lot of different areas within the contract that we see, comments are an option. Attaching or adding attachments to a comment is also one of the options when creating that milestone or deliverable. But really, there's this additional layer of notification that happens. So that the user, that contract manager, they can send an email directly from that milestone or deliverable to the person who it's assigned to. They can copy themselves, they can CC someone else, they can create some email context. The system will kind of populate just some generic information, the contract that it's referring to, that it's a milestone, and I think maybe here's the due date. But you can add a customized message into that email notification. And the thing that I love is that the system tracks that. So, you have people say, well, I sent, George and legal my contract to review a week ago and I haven't seen it yet. What's going on? And if you need to kind of really look at that information, you just go right to the deliverable or milestone, open up that notification. It's time-stamped with all of that detail. The other important part that I think is really helpful is milestone and deliverables is an out-of-the-box functionality list view. So it can be used for reporting, tracking. It tells the contract manager how many days until this, this deliverable or milestone is due. So it's just, again, it's a feature that's there. I see very little organizations leverage it. They, most of them talk about wanting to have this level of visibility. This is going to get you that.
Yeah, that sounds super helpful, and like it doesn't require a lot of effort to stand up. So if someone or a customer was looking to leverage milestones and deliverables, but they're not very familiar with that, what kind of advice would you have wished you had known the first time you had worked with milestones and deliverables? What might be helpful for them to know or understand going into that?
Yeah, I think because the level of effort is so minimal, and clients have a dev or a test environment, it's something that they can kind of jump into right away. And again, like I said, it gives that level of visibility that clients often speak about needing to have. It gives them that extra level of insight into the agreement. And this is something that I've continued and really started to heavily advocate for the use of this function to all of the contract manager clients that I've been working with. Again, it just increases that transparency. It helps to hold those individuals accountable within the organization, and it gives that additional tracking. And with this type of functionality, you've got to find some information. You're not searching back through months of old emails to find out what you need. It's literally housed and contained right within the application. So again, testing it out, if you've got that environment, go for it. Understand what kind of deliverables or milestones you want to track and be consistent throughout the organization. And just kind of keep that in mind. And if it's something that after a testing phase, folks say, yes, this is great, let's go, let's use it. Definitely communicate that to your end user or the person that you are assigning responsible for that task. We all get hundreds of emails a day, and because the system generates an email, if they know that this operational change is going to occur, then that might help them to say like, oh, okay, cool, I can add, this deliverable to my calendar because I received a notification that says I'm the person responsible for it. So just kind of helps to increase the transparency as well.
That's great. That's the only thing better than having information at your fingertips is being able to leverage that information and make it useful and make it work for you. So that's awesome. So we said this conversation was only going to last 20 minutes, but it's been so good. We're keeping going here. So we have one more topic, a couple more questions to talk on before we open it up. But one thing that's really important that I want to make sure we address is something that's important to the long-term viability of your product and solution and staying current. So Sasha, what kind of tools or information do you use or are you aware of that are out there that is informative and lets you know things that are happening, that are being developed, things that are changing or could be expected to come?
So one thing that Infor provides is through their Infor documentation, you get to see releases and the information on current releases and upcoming releases. And I actually found some information for the next CU that'll be this March. Well, will probably be in like a few weeks. So for the CU 77, one thing that I found was specific to contract management is messages in PO cost messages or invoice messages specific to service contracts. I think that's important to talk about. With one of the updates, you're going to find that with the cost messages, it'll be created for service contract invoices that exceed the lifetime maximum. And they're specific to say it's for service by quantity items, not by amount. So as we know, this kind of impacts contract management, but it's also going to impact invoice matching as well. And we're going to find here that there's some things that they recommend for you to do to test this out and ensure that it works. And that's something that I will test in the test or development environment before bringing that over to production, just to observe the behaviors of what's happening moving forward. But with that, it's gonna require the invoice entry cost messaging for service items on match companies, and there's gonna be a process of service contract invoice that exceeds the lifetime maximum, and then you're gonna review the cost message created for service by quantity items that are out of tolerance. So this is similar to having like a PO cost message where you have an invoice message based off cost differences for a purchase order to invoice relationship. The other thing that I thought was going to be pretty helpful to know would be the alert links for resolved invoice messages for service messaging contracts. So this again impacts invoice messaging, and it's going to require setup as well from the match company level. but it also impacts contract management, where the buyer or the contract specialist will be notified via email about the message, and then navigating to that contract, or specifically the contract information, you're going to find an open service invoice message for you to review. And once you resolve the message, it'll update the same section in the specifically contracts and alerts link tab of the contract. It's going to update it to resolved invoice message. So those are the latest and greatest updates for March.
Awesome. And I believe that on the Infor support website, they do have an area where that mid-month you're able to get a sneak peek at the new functionality that's being pushed out in the next CU, the following month. So it is a good place to check to make sure that you're aware of any kind of changes that might be impactful or beneficial to you and your organization. Awesome. Well, thank you very much for joining us today for our panel discussion on contract management. A big shout out and thank you to Sasha and Stephanie for sharing their experiences and expertise with us. And with that, I'd like to open this up for questions. Okay, I'm seeing a couple questions come in. And the first question we have is it better to walk and learn the system before trying to do all it could do? It sounds like the question is kind of asking, is it better to take it slow and understand what we're doing in the system before we start trying to do everything all at once?
Yeah, Sasha, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think it definitely is better to take your time, learn the system. Something to keep in mind is that with contract management, it's very new and very different than if someone's familiar with Lawson and using the PO25 screen with agreements. You're going to be just getting acclimated to a new system, brand new field, and just understanding the language and differences between the two. And with that, you just want to keep in mind the importance of having like a phased approach, and that can just really be within departments. With purchasing departments, this is something that they'll have to adapt to right away. But with other departments, let's say like legal, that's something that they can be brought in towards the second approach or the second phase while you're still learning and understanding the system. And yeah, that's all.
Okay. And for the next question kind of piggybacks on that, and it's along the lines of if for net new contract management implementations, is it common to see a two-phased approach, which you kind of answered, but is there anything else you'd like to add, how common it is, or if it's newer, you more so recommend that it's your implementation is broken down into more bite-sized chunks?
Yeah, I'd be happy to address that one. So in a lot of instances with the implementations that I've participated in, as Sasha mentioned, procurement doesn't have an option. Their PO25 agreements are now in contract management. But a lot of other departments, such as legal or grants, risk management, things like that, a lot of times in my experience, I've seen that those departments actually have a process of their own, typically outside of a system. The most common that I've seen is in SharePoint, where maybe they're loading their executed contracts to, a central location within a T drive or something like that where people can access it. So for those new type of implementations where you have those users that, don't have any familiarity with Lawson or with contract management, definitely that primary focus, should be the procurement team. Whether you're in the public sector or in healthcare, you really want to make sure you're getting the right price for the right items day one. So that's the primary focus. So it's definitely common. It's definitely recommended. It helps even from a design perspective to kind of break down what it is that the users and teams need, because, you know, procurement and purchasing needs are going to be very different than the needs of, you know, risk management or the legal team. So absolutely.
Thank you. And the last question I'm seeing here is in regards to a specific type of contract and asking how complex is it to implement the usage of physician contracts, more so for healthcare related
Sure.
clients?
I think that's a good question. It's something that, you know, at times is one of those areas that kind of sneaks up on you. Typically, you see with physician contracts that there are some expense contracts, and then you see some that are revenue type contracts. And you really want to address them separately because they're going to function and behave in the system a little bit differently. So it's not that it's incredibly complex from a functional standpoint, getting those contracts into the system. It's more of wanting to make sure throughout the design process that you capture the specific details to help identify and set them apart. Typically with those types of contracts, there's a little bit different process flow that you know, the user does in their day-to-day for those expense versus, you know, maybe those revenue contracts. So again, identifying those in the design process, documenting how it's different, can identify different functionality within the system that may be more useful for one type over the other.
I am not seeing any other questions come through. If you think of anything in the near future or down the line, please feel free to reach out to us. You could always send questions to questions@rpic.com, and we will do our best to get back to you in a timely and thorough fashion. I'd like to thank everyone again for your time and joining us today. We hope to see you again soon.
Absolutely.
Thank you.